Hi JavaScript. We will be discussing all your ES5 features.
Hi Drupals, let's discuss.
Do you have split personality disorder?
What do you mean?
Because you can be executed in normal mode and also in strict mode.
Oh, that is the choice that you make.
What are the benefits of using strict mode?
Strict mode eliminates silent errors by changing them to throw errors. Strict mode can be made to run faster than identical code that is not the strict mode. Also, it prohibits some syntax likely to be defined in future versions of ECMA script.
Let's go one by one. Before that, tell me how to invoke strict mode.
Just place the use strict statement in the script to apply for the entire script or at the start of the function body. Strict mode cannot be used inside functions with default parameters, rest parameters, or destructuring parameters.
Okay, now the first benefit of using strict mode. What are all errors which are silent in non-strict mode but get thrown in strict mode?
In strict mode, when you assign a value to a variable that is not declared, a reference error is thrown. Here, the reference error is thrown when you attempt to assign a value to undeclared variable high. But in non-strict mode, the variable is added to the global object. Use global this to assign value to global object in strict mode. Assignment to non-writable properties nan, undefined, infinity throws type error in strict mode, while in non-strict mode, this error is silenced. Here in object obj1, a read-only property A is defined. Assignment to this read-only property throws type error in strict mode, while in non-strict mode, this error is silenced. Creating a new property on the non-extensible object throws type error in strict mode. Here, object obj1 is not extensible. When you attempt to create a new property on this object, type error is thrown, while in non-strict mode, this error is silenced. Attempting to delete a non-configurable property of an object throws the type error. Here, attempting to delete the length property of array object throws type error, whereas in non-strict mode, this error is silenced. Duplicate argument names in function throw the syntax error in strict mode. Here, function hello has the first two arguments with the same name a, so it throws syntax error. Whereas in non-strict mode, the last duplicated argument hides previous identically named argument, but the values are still accessible through arguments. Here, function hello1 has the first two arguments with same name a. The value of variable a inside hello1 function is 4, but two arguments can be accessed through arguments. Even in non-strict mode, duplicate parameter names throw the syntax error when default parameters are used as in function hello2, when rest parameters are used as in function hello3, or when destructured parameters are used as in function hello4 and hello5. Strict mode forbids prefixing numbers with 0 for octal numbers. Here, syntax error is thrown when attempting to use a number with prefix 0 for octal number, whereas it is allowed in non-strict mode. Novice developers may think prefixing with 0 has no semantic meaning. To use octal numbers in strict mode, you must prefix the numbers with 0 prefix. Strict mode forbids setting properties on primitive values. Here, attempting to set value for a property on a primitive value throws type error, whereas in non-strict mode, this error is silenced.
That is quite a lot. I'm loving strict mode already. I'm eager to know its second benefit, making strict mode code run faster.
Strict mode simplifies how variable names map to particular variable definitions in the code. Many compiler optimizations rely on the ability to say that variable X is stored in that location. That is critical to fully optimizing the code. Let's see how. Strict mode prohibits with statement. With makes it possible to access the property of the supplied object by directly mentioning its name alone. If the property is not present in the supplied object, then it is resolved from surrounding scope or even from global scope. It is impossible to determine this resolution until runtime. Strict mode throws syntax error when with is used. Here, in non-strict mode, X may be accessed from the supplied object. If the property does not exist on that object, then it will be const X. In strict mode, eval does not introduce new variables into the surrounding scope as variable y value is not changed by eval. In non-strict mode, eval of var x introduces variable x in the surrounding function or global scope as variable x value is changed by eval. Strict mode does not allow accessing function name.arguments and function name.caller values, and it throws type error, whereas it can be accessed in non-strict mode. In strict mode, there is no sync between the arguments object and the parameters passed to the function. Here the function strict mode func modifies its parameter x, but it is not reflected in the arguments array's corresponding index. Also, modifying the arguments array does not reflect in the method parameter. But in non-strict mode, if a function parameter is changed, its corresponding arguments object index property will also be changed and vice versa. Strict mode does not box the primitive value sent as the binding value for this. Here, the value undefined, 2, null, and true sent as binding for function is not boxed inside the function f. Whereas in non-strict mode, the undefined and null is converted to global object window, value 2 and true is converted to its corresponding boxed object. In strict mode, functions declared inside a block will be accessible only inside that block. Here, attempting to access function FA throws reference error, whereas in non-strict mode, a function declared inside a block is available outside the block as well.
Great! Why do people want to use non-strict mode while strict mode is so good? Now, about third benefit, prohibiting syntax that may be implemented in the future.
In strict mode, there are extra reserved words that cannot be used as names. Here, attempting to use eval and arguments as names throws syntax error, whereas in non-strict mode, this error is silenced. In strict mode, reserved words, implements, interface, let, package, private, protected, public, static, yield cannot be used as variable names, whereas it can be used in non-strict mode.
Just make strict mode as default and deprecate the normal mode. Do not worry about backward compatibility.
Migrating from normal mode to strict mode is not that easy. Websites that depend on non-strict mode code suffers a lot.
Makes sense. What are all the string related features that are included with you starting ES5?
String characters can be accessed with index rather than using caret function. Multi-line strings are possible. Trim function which removes leading and trailing white spaces is introduced.
Nice. Can you list all the ES5 array features that you have acquired?
Array.isArray is used to check if a passed value is an array. Here, true is returned for these two statements. It returns true for any value that was created using array literal syntax or array constructor.
What is the difference between using an instance of check and this method? Are they the same?
No, instance of just checks whether array.prototype value is present in the passed object. So, array-like objects when passed to instance of can return true. Here, an object with thunder proto referring to array.prototype passes the instance of check but fails array.isArray check. Now, when the obj and array literal is passed as this binding to the object.prototype.toString method, it produces a different output. Any value that produces object array for this method would pass the array.isArray check.
For typed arrays, the toString method will return a different output like object u in 16 array.
Yes, false is returned for typed arrays.
Better to use array.isArray instead of instance of. Let's go to next array method.
Array.forEach function of array instance executes the provided function once for each array element. Array.forEach accepts two arguments, callback function and this arg. Three parameters are passed to the callback function. They are the current element being processed, index of the current element in the array, and the array instance on which for each is called upon. This arg is the value to be used for this while executing the callback function. Here, object obj is created with count, sum, and increasing property. Obj is passed along with the callback function to arr.forEach method. Inside the callback function, the elements along with the current index gets printed. The third argument, this arr, is used to check whether elements are increasing.
But we already have a reference to ARR. We can use that.
Yes, the third argument is useful when you do not have access to array like calling forEach method on an anonymous array.
What is the return value of array.forEach method?
It returns undefined.
What happens when it encounters an array with empty slots?
Callback function will not be invoked for empty slots.
Does undefined or null or empty string or any false value is same as empty slots?
No, empty slots means there are no values for a specific index in the array object.
As in for loop, can I use break statement for early exit?
There is no way for early termination in for each function other than throwing an exception.
If I pass an async function, does it wait for the promise to resolve for each array element?
No, it does not.
What if I pass some other value other than array type?
You can. Array.forEach expects the passed object to have length property and it executes for all integer indexed property less than length if it exists. Here, an object with length and integer properties are created and passed as binding to this for array.prototype.forEach method and passed callback function as argument.
Next array method.
Array.map function creates and returns a new array populated with the result of calling the provided function on every element in the calling array. Similar to for each method, you will pass a callback function and this binding for callback function. Here, each element in the array is squared in the returned array.
Does array.map modify the past array?
No, it creates a new array with transformed elements.
Can I access this new array inside the callback function?
No, the third argument is the passed array. You can only access the returned array that array.map returns.
Okay, I think I can pass the parseInt function as a callback function to array.map method to convert an array of strings to an array of integers.
You cannot do that. ParseInt function accepts radix value as second argument, but the callback function receives the current element index as a second argument. Both have different meanings. You can wrap the parsing call with another function.
Thanks for pointing it out. How about the execution of callback function on sparse arrays?
Same behavior as array.forEach method, it just ignores the empty slots.
How about passing array-like objects? Same behavior as array.forEach method. You have to pass that object to array.prototype.map method as a binding for this while passing the callback function as argument. Next array method.
Array.filter method creates and returns the shallow copy of a portion of a given array with only elements that when passed to the given callback function returns true. Filter function receives two parameters, callback function and this arg, similar to for each and map method. Here, positive elements are filtered into a separate array.
How about array.filter usage on sparse arrays and array-like objects?
Same behavior as array.forEach. Here, the filter method created a new array with length equal to number of array elements for which the callback function returned true. But the map function created a new array with same length. So, the filter method actually removes the empty slots as well. Array-like objects can be passed to array.prototype.filter method as a binding for this while passing the callback function as argument.
Next array method.
Array.reduce method accepts a callback function with four parameters: accumulator, current, index, and array. Accumulator value is the value returned from previous calculation, and current is the value of the current element being processed. Other three parameters are similar to filter method. We can also pass an initial value as the second argument to the reduce method, which will be used as an accumulator for processing the first element in the array. Here, the sum of the array is calculated passing the initial value 10.
If I do not pass the initial value,
Then the first non-empty element will be used as the initial value. An iteration starts from the next non-empty element. Here, first element 1 is taken as initial value and the iteration starts from the next element 2.
if I do not pass the initial value while calling the array.reduce method on an empty array or on an array where there is no element for initial value,
Then type error is thrown.
what does the array.reduce method return?
Reduce method returns the value that is returned from the last execution of the callback function.
What if I want to pass this binding for the callback function as in the array.map method?
Array.reduce does not accept callback function this binding.
Will my callback function get executed when I call reduce method on an array which has a single value and also initial value is not passed?
No, the single value is returned. Also, the callback function will not be executed when you call reduce method on an empty array with initial value. In that case, initial value is returned.
How about sparse arrays and array-like objects?
Same behavior as array.forEach method. For sparse arrays, empty slots are ignored. Array-like objects can be passed to array.prototype.reduce method as a binding for this while passing the callback function as argument.
Next array method.
Array.reduce write, which is very similar to array.reduce, but it starts iterating from last. Here, the sum example is used with array.reduce write method.
Cool. Next array method.
Array.every method takes a callback function and returns true if the callback function returns true for every element passed as an argument to it or false otherwise. Similar to for each method, we can pass a callback function and this arg. If the callback function returns falsy value for any array element, then false is returned immediately, stopping the array iteration. Here, we check whether every element in the array is an even number. The iteration stopped at fifth element 15 as code returned false for that element.
When every method is called on an empty array.
Then it returns true.
How about sparse arrays and array-like objects?
Same behavior as array.forEach method. For sparse arrays, empty slots are ignored. Here, only element 1 is processed. Array-like objects can be passed to array.prototype.every method as a binding for this while passing the callback function as argument.
Next array method.
Array.sum function takes a callback function and returns true if the callback function returns true for at least one element or false otherwise. Similar to array.every function, it takes two arguments, callback and this arg. If the callback returns a true value for any array element, true is returned immediately, stopping the array iteration.
When some method is called on an empty array.
Then it returns false.
How about sparse arrays and array-like objects?
Same behavior as array.forEach method. For sparse arrays, empty slots are ignored. Here, only element 1 is processed. Array-like objects can be passed to array.prototype.sum method as a binding for this while passing the callback function as argument.
Next array method.
Array.indexOf returns the first index at which the given element can be found compared by its strict equality triple equals operator or -1 if not present. It receives two arguments, search element, the element to be searched, and from index, the index to start searching from based on zero based index. If search element is none, it always returns -1.
If I pass a negative number for from index or number greater than or equal to array.length.
If you pass a negative index that is greater than or equal to minus array.length, then it is converted as from index plus array.length. If a negative index less than minus array.length is passed, then 0 is used. If from index greater than or equal to array.length is passed, then array is not searched and minus 1 is returned. Here, minus 1 is changed to 4 and search is started from index 4.
How about sparse arrays and array-like objects?
Same behavior as array.forEach method. For sparse arrays, empty slots are ignored. Here, empty elements are not searched. Array-like objects can be passed to array.prototype.index of method as a binding for this while passing the callback function as argument.
Next array method.
Array.lastIndexOf is similar to array.indexOf, but it searches backwards starting from index. If from index is negative, it is converted to from index plus array.length. If from index is greater than or equal to minus array.length, minus 1 is returned without searching the array. If from index is greater than or equal to array.length, then array.length minus 1 is assigned to from index, searching the whole array.
It will be a pleasure working with arrays with these helper methods. Can you explain JSON.parse function?
The JSON.parse function parses a JSON string constructing the value described by string. An optional reviver function can be provided to perform a transformation on resulting object before it is returned. It takes two arguments, text, the JSON string which should be passed, and the reviver function. The reviver function is called with three arguments, key, the key associated with value, the value produced by parsing, and optional context that holds state relevant to current expression to be revived. Context is only passed while reviving primitive values and it contains a property source referring to original JSON string representing this value. Here, the JSON string is converted to JSON object, transforming the value of property C from 4 to 10.
Can you tell me how this reviver function is invoked by JSON.parse?
Here, the properties are parsed and transformed using reviver function according to depth first search algorithm. First, property A is transformed, then property C is accessed, its value is changed to 10, then property B is accessed, and the root object is accessed passing an empty string as key. Only for primitive values, that is for property A and C, the context object is passed with source property referring to original JSON string representation. This value inside reviver function is the object containing the property being processed if the reviver function is not an arrow function.
What happens when the reviver function does not return any value?
If the reviver function does not return any value or returns undefined, the property is deleted from the object or the value is redefined to be the returned value if the reviver function returns any value other than undefined. Even if the reviver function does not transform the value, it has to return the value to be included in the object. Here, only if the key is an empty string, the value is returned, so no properties will be present in the past object.
What happens when I define an object with empty string as key? How to differentiate from the root object value?
There is no way to specifically handle the root object transformation.
Does it throw an error when text is not a valid JSON string?
Yes, syntax error is thrown if the passed JSON string does not comply with JSON grammar. As an example, extra comma is not allowed in array and object JSON string representation.
Can you explain the JSON.stringify method?
JSON.stringify converts a JavaScript value to a JSON string, optionally replacing values if a replacer function is specified, or optionally including only the specified properties if a replacer array is specified. If two JSON exists in a value, then its return value is used for stringification. JSON.stringify function takes three arguments: object, replacer function or array, and space. The replacer function takes two arguments: the key and value. The object in which key was found is passed as the this context to the replacer function if it is not an array function. If object is processed, then key is the property name. If array is processed, then key is the array index as string. And if the root object, then key is empty string. Here, an object is stringified using JSON.stringify method. Replacer function is also passed, which does not return value when value is null. So JSON object.c.e is not included in the output. JSON string 2 is created by passing JSON object and the replacer array, and only those keys are included in the output.
Can you tell me how the replacer function is invoked?
Replacer function is first invoked with the empty string as key and the passed value as value. Then each property of the object is passed to the replacer function, its property name as key and its value as value. If the value is an array, then the replacer function is called with each array element index as string as key and element as value. If value is an object, then replacer function is called recursively for that object. In the reviver function of JSON.parse method, the leaf elements of the object tree are called first and its parents are called next. Also, the reviver function is called after parsing the particular string source, but in the replacer function passed to JSON.stringify method, the root object is called first and its children are called next, and which is called before stringification.
Some of my object properties which are not enumerable are not serialized. Map and set type properties have empty object values. Why?
Properties are visited using the same algorithm as object.keys. Only enumerable properties are visited, as object.keys will only return objects enumerable properties. So map set becomes an empty object. Here property G is not visited by JSON.stringify method.
How do some value types like undefined get stringified since the string undefined is different from undefined?
Stringification process converts symbol or function or undefined to null if it is found in array, or in case of object the property is omitted but passed to replacer function. NaN and infinity are converted to null values. Primitive values are directly serialized. Wrapped objects like boolean, number are first converted to primitive values and stringified. When arrays are serialized, only integer indexed keys less than its length property is included. Symbol keyed properties are omitted and also not passed to the replacer function. For any other object, stringification is done recursively.
How to configure to JSON?
If the toJSON function is present in the value, then it is responsible to define what data will be serialized. The value returned by toJSON will be serialized. JSON.stringify calls the toJSON method with one parameter, key, which has the same semantic as the key parameter of the replacer function. Here, toJSON method are included in time opt. During stringification, this method is invoked and its return value is stringified.
Is there a way to specifically handle the root object?
Yes, unlike the reviver function in JSON.parse, which is invoked last with the root object, the replacer function in JSON.stringify function is called first with the root object. You can maintain a boolean state whether you have processed the root object to handle the root object specifically. Here is root called variable is used to check whether the root object is already passed to the replacer function.
What happens if I pass an object with circular reference?
Type error is thrown. Here, this is referenced by the property A in the object opt, creating the circular reference.
I have learnt about the JSON.parse and JSON.stringify methods. Can you explain the new date functions?
Three date functions have been added to me since ES5. They are date.nowStatic function returns number of milliseconds elapsed since January 1, 1970. Date.prototype.toISO string returns date formatted in ISO 8601 format. Date.prototype.toJSON returns value returned by toISO string method.
Nice. Those are the most essential features. Can you explain getters and setters?
Getters and setters can be defined inside the object, then it can be used as normal object properties. Reserved words can be used as object property names.
What are all the object methods added to you since ES5?
Object.createStatic method creates a new object using an existing object as the prototype of the newly created object. It accepts two arguments, proto, the object that is set as prototype of newly created object, and properties object, which specifies the property descriptors to be added to the newly created object with corresponding property names. This value is same as the arguments passed to object.define properties, which we will discuss later. Here, a person object contains one method, printIntro, which accesses this object's name property. Peter object is created with person object as prototype and the property name is defined in the newly created object. Now, the printIntro method is invoked on the Peter object.
What happens when I pass null value to the first argument?
The newly created object's prototype value will be null. If any value other than object or null is specified, then type error is thrown.
Next object method.
Object.keyStatic function returns an array of given object's own enumerable string keyed property names. If string value is passed, array of character indexes are returned. If other primitive values are passed, then empty array is returned. If null or undefined is passed, then type error is thrown.
What if I want to get all values of the object?
If you need the property values, use object.values instead. If you need both the property keys and values, use object.entries instead.
Next object method.
Object.define property adds a new property or modifies an existing property of the object and returns the past object. It takes three arguments: object, the object on which to define the property, prop, a string or symbol specifying the key of the property to be defined or modified, and descriptor, the descriptor for the property being defined or modified.
How to configure the descriptor?
There are two flavors, data descriptors and accessor descriptors. Both descriptors have common optional keys. They are configurable and enumerable. Data descriptors have two optional keys. They are value and writable. Accessor descriptors have two optional keys. They are get and set.
What is configurable in the descriptor object?
As name suggests, when this property is set to false, that property cannot be changed between data and accessor property. That property cannot be deleted. Other attributes of the descriptor cannot be changed. However, if writable is true, then value can be changed and writable can be changed to false. Configurable property's default value is false. When tried to modify the existing property with descriptor configurable property set to false, a type error is thrown.
What is enumerable in the descriptor object?
As name suggests, if it is true that property show up in enumeration of properties, its default value is false.
What is the value property in the data descriptor?
It is the value associated with the property.
What is the writable property in the data descriptor?
If it is true, value associated with the property can be changed.
What is the get property in the accessor descriptor?
It is a function which serves as the getter for the property or undefined if there is no getter. When the property is accessed, this function is called without arguments and this is set to the object through which the property is accessed. This may not be the same as the object on which the property is defined due to inheritance.
What is the set property in the accessor descriptor?
It is a function which serves as the setter for the property or undefined if there is no setter. When the property is assigned, this function is called with one argument, the value being assigned to the property, and this set to the object through which the property is assigned.
As all the properties are optional, how do you determine the flavor when no value, writable, get or set is defined?
Then it is treated as a data descriptor.
What if a descriptor contains both value or writable and get or set properties?
Then an exception is thrown.
What if I want to change an accessor descriptor to a data descriptor?
Just provide a new descriptor with writable or value property.
Next object method.
Object.defined properties can add or modify multiple properties of an object. It receives two arguments, object, the object to its properties have to be added or modified, and props, whose keys are object property names and values are property descriptors.
Next object method.
Object.getOwnProperty descriptor static function gets the descriptor of a property directly present on an object. Mutating the returned descriptor has no effect. It takes two arguments, object and property name or symbol.
What happens when property does not exist in the object?
Undefined is returned. Here, property A does not exist. GetOwnProperty descriptor returns undefined.
Next object method.
Object.getOwnProperty descriptor static function returns all objects' own property descriptors. It accepts one argument, object.
Next object method.
Object.getOwnProperty names returns an array of all property names including non-enumerable properties except for those that use symbols.
Next object method.
Object.getPrototype static function returns the object's prototype, that is the value of internal prototype property.
Next object method.
Object.preventExtension static method prevents new properties from ever being added to an object. It also prevents object prototypes from being reassigned. Existing properties or non-extensible object can still be deleted. Type error is thrown when you try to add a new property to a non-extensible object in strict mode.
What if I create properties on non-extensible objects prototype?
You can create. Here a new property is added to prototype object.
Can I convert a non-extensible object to an extensible object?
No, you cannot make it extensible again.
Next object method.
Object.isExtensible static method determines whether an object is extensible.
Next object method.
Object.seal static function prevents an object from extension and makes existing properties as non-configurable. Values of the existing properties can be changed as long as they are writable. As all properties are non-configurable, objects' own properties cannot be deleted.
Next object method.
Object.isSealed static function determines whether an object is sealed. As sealed objects are not also extensible, the isExtensible methods returns false for sealed objects.
Next object method. Object.freeze. Freezing an object prevents extension and makes all existing properties non-configurable and non-writable. Arrays can be frozen. Doing so prevents addition of elements and deletion or modification of existing elements. Next object method.
Object.isFrozen determines whether an object is frozen. Since the frozen object is also sealed and non-extensible, isSealed and isExtensible methods return true and false respectively for frozen objects.
Great. There is more than a dozen of object management. Can you explain the bind method?
Bind method returns a new function that when called calls this function with its this keyword set to the provided value and a given sequence of argument preceding any are provided when the new function is called. The function which the bind call wraps is the target function. Calling the bounded function with this binding and fixed arguments is equivalent to calling the target function passing the value for this binding and arguments.
What happens when I pass null or undefined to this binding?
When null and undefined is passed for this keyword in non-strict mode, it is replaced by global object and primitive values will be boxed. In strict mode, the same value is passed.
If I call a bounded function with the new keyword, will the bounded function use the passed value for this as opposed to creating a new object?
No, when called with the new keyword, the value for this binding is ignored.
Can I call the bind method on an already bounded function?
Calling bind on multiple layers, passing the value for the first argument alone has the same effect as calling bind single time, because ultimately the target function is called with this value which is passed in the first bind call.
Okay, what if I pass some arguments for the target function in multiple layers of bind call?
When bind is called with arguments on multiple layers, then the arguments are in order that are received by the lowermost bounded function, then arguments received by the bounded function one layer above, and so on.
Does bind changes the name property of the function?
Yes, a bounded function's name property has the value of the target function prefixed with the bound keyword.
Nice feature. What is the object or array trailing comma feature?
Now we can place trailing commas while declaring object properties.
Thanks for explaining all the ESY features.
Thanks, bye.
Bye. Thanks. If you find this video valuable, you may share it with others. If there are mistakes, please mention them in the comment section.